sessions is presented by Brenda Senior. She is a PhD student in educational policy and global studies. She looks at the significant growth of mobile telephone industry in Kenya and how mobile phones help to circulate grassroots feminism and cultural products among others. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Brenda Sanya, and I'm excited to be here to present today. One of the reasons why I wrote this paper, and actually I should start off by saying I want to thank the Center for African Studies, Marbo and Maimuna Laro, who saw this paper in the early parts. I did a brown bag last January, so not this year, but last January at the Center for African Studies, kind of trying to tease this paper out, and it came out in Feminist Africa in December, and Professor Teresa Barnes, who's also here in the history department, is on the editorial board of Feminist Africa. So what I was trying to do with this paper was to think about the mobile phone beyond how I had seen it discussed. So a lot of the conversations that around mobile phone technology are seen to be basically around modernization, microfinance, leapfrogging, literacy, and kind of those traditional development model conversations. And while those are very important, one of the things that I was hoping to do with this paper and kind of trying to structure around this paper was to move forward beyond that and think about it as a theoretical lens that can be discussed on a broader level in terms of what is going on with the mobile phone as a transmitter. So not necessarily looking at it as the mobile phone necessarily. It can be, like the French saying, which is like, this is not a pipe, because a pipe can do many different things. So I was thinking, this is not a phone. It can do many different things. So this is slowly changing also, and so I'm not the only one doing it. The University of Cape Town, a faculty member in the media studies, Sarah Chium, will really help me frame this work and think about how the mobile phone can be considered as a tool for agency. So with this transmitter of education, there's the possibility to reveal the multiplicities of Black rural Kenyan women's identities, which are sometimes depicted as stagnant or monolithic. So here I'm arguing that with the new users of information technology, they can assert their agency and speak their own voices into governmental and into public policy conversations. And so bringing to the forefront the discussion of possibilities of the circulation and the plurality of and multiplicity of identities, modes of resistance, cooperation, grassroots, and indigenous feminisms that are not only innovative but are also actually happening is kind of where I locate the mobile phone. And so I argue that it might not actually be happening yet, but there's the question of what are the social lives of different entities that we use, and how do human beings impact how those technologies are used. So here I introduce M-Pesa, which I'm sure most Africans are familiar with, but it's often hailed as being, the world's largest phone banking system. And we'll just watch a short clip, about 2 minutes long, and then I'll continue from there. As he finds it, I guess I can continue. So scholars like Chubo have kind of argued that we need to move away from thinking about just the tools as how they are used, but in terms of thinking about how there's a dialectic relationship between the structure and agency of social practices and how we think about how people use technologies. So following Chiyumbo's decentering of the instrument technology and the technology itself, I started to consider how technology's transformative capacities
When a group of engineers
hold in tension the social agents' capacity to utilize the technology and shape them for their own use, and then consequently see them as social subjects and systems that we can think about in terms of producing and reforming each other.
The mobile phone is people's first interaction with technology.
Kenya is in the midst of a handheld revolution.
The mobile phone is people's first interaction with technology in a meaningful way, and sometimes their only way.
Everybody has prepaid phone lines, and data here is very affordable. You can buy a megabyte for about $1 US.
Easy access to phone lines and cheap data means the majority of Kenya's population can now connect to the internet.
Most Kenyan, about 90%, regularly access internet through the mobile phone.
That means the solutions coming from here are going to be based on a small screen model.
Safaricom is Kenya's largest cell phone service. They seized a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, releasing a product called M-Pesa.
It's the leading mobile money payment system in the world, and 60% of the user base doesn't have a bank account.
It enables a mobile phone to work like a debit card. During a transaction, money is deducted from a prepaid account connected to a user's phone.
M-Pesa wasn't needed in the West because everybody already had credit cards and bank accounts. So basically what Safaricom's created is another bank.
Money can be sent to other users and bills can be paid. Even purchases can be made at stores.
Not everyone depends on it as a way of transferring money.
The only significant change in money since credit cards 60 years ago is M-Pesa. The transaction costs are so minimal that banks cannot compete with it.
But it has limitations too. Right now it's only active in a handful of countries. High-tech competitors like Google are trying to replicate M-Pesa's success on a larger scale.
Google would like to be able to do their payment card system in a lot of countries across the developing world.
Google is currently testing Beba, a cashless payment system, on Nairobi city buses.
Many other societies across the world will eventually adopt mobile money transfer systems similar to M-Pesa.
Okay, so I chose this clip, it was Mariette, that you can pick up if you think about M-Pesa, and I was very clear why I chose that, because the first thing that I noticed was there was no women, not at all. The first face that you see is a white Western face, founder of iHub, and iHub is much younger than M-Pesa. And the story that goes in Kenya is that how M-Pesa was formed was, people who would go to the city to, for the day would go and buy a lot of credit and put it on their phone, and then they would go back to the village for people who hadn't traveled to the city, and then they would sell the credit because people had cash but didn't have the credit. And so then the mobile phone company started realizing, oh wait, people are transferring money on the phones, so then why don't we create this as a system and charge people for it? So it grew out of the users, but we never hear about it, right? So it's just heard about in terms of what the innovators did, but it's an example of how the users were actually mobilizing and demanding that the products that they have serves them in the way that they feel that they need it to be. So it kind of became the way that, and similarly we see within the mobile phone, Africans started, I'm sure anyone who's lived in Africa that has a cell phone there, like the idea of flashing, which is kind of like people would you call and then you hang up immediately so that someone has to call you back. And so that created the what we even now have in the United States in terms of the text message that just says, please call me, or became an immediate option on all my mobile phones. So in terms of thinking about who we think of as innovators and who we think of as users, the mobile phone specifically, I centered in that sense that it's not necessarily being used in the way that people have always assumed. Slide has moved on here. Excuse me. All right, so in thinking about African feminism, I also, this paper for me was a way of considering how the mobile phone is able to create a space where we can think about African feminism. I think a lot of people have been resistant to feminism in some social spaces in Africa because they see it as an external or westernized kind of idea. And so thinking about how we think about feminism and think about how Africans are participating in empowering women, and women are getting a chance to speak to themselves. So even though I use some Western thinkers in terms of helping me think about feminism, I'm definitely focused on the works of Oyoronke Oyoumi and on Ama Ataitu from Ghana and Nigeria, in helping me structure and think about how, if we think about the African continent and we don't think about it in terms of considering where women's rights are, then we're in a very problematic state. And that is not based on saying that that excludes men, but we are highlighting the fact that societies have been structured in a way that foreground the desires and needs, and most importantly, the outcomes that are most important to men. So in thinking about the local context, the mobile phone then becomes a way to allow women to have a private space to access their own money, have ways of participating in national politics and global agendas. And also it's significant because women can then be part of self-describing themselves. They can also be part of having a voice that is not prevented by someone else. And so I talk about in this section, I kind of think about, it's kind of a simultaneous disruption and circulation of ideas. So when we think about how African women are depicted, there's the positives, strong and this and that, and then on the negative, it's poor and suffering. And so again, in terms of the importance of thinking about how women can self-identify, and they don't need to be spoken, they can be spoken of, but in terms of ensuring that we speak of African women in their own voices. So thinking about also how women can have virtual infrastructures to create social spaces where they can kind of work on their own and participate in different political and civic education policies. So in 2010, Kenya passed a new constitution, and it's always surprising to many people, but it's the first time that women finally had a chance to inherit land in Kenya. Prior to that, women could not inherit land. The only way that they had access to owning land was through purchasing it. And one of the reasons why the constitution passed was that overwhelmingly, close to 80% of women voted yes because of a civic engagement plan organized by FIDA Kenya and Warembo Nias, which are two feminist organizations. One is kind of an old school, traditional 1980s feminist group, and the other one is a group of young women. And what they did is they would go to community events and get women's mobile phone numbers and collect information and translate into specific languages what sections of the Constitution meant. So in 140 characters say, section this says this about women's rights. And so even when political leaders would come into town campaigning with their own personal agendas, women already were able to access their own information in figuring out how they participated in what their needs and what they wanted out of the Constitution. So then also the other thing that has happened is kind of alliances with diasporic, and I'm talking about diaspora within the country. So women who say their daughters go into the city to work, or have their sisters are married elsewhere, there's still a network and a creation of a virtual space where there can be a continued relationship. And then just kind of, and I'll talk a little bit about this, but one of the things is, so when the article came out, I was very nervous because writing about it from a space of distance, which I'm sure a lot of you who are scholars here are worried about, is as we're doing this research, how do people at home respond to it? But I've received numerous tweets from across the world, but mostly from Africa, so from like South Africa, from Take Back the Tech actually is across Africa feminist tech organization, and they had a conference and they featured our journal. Gender IT has been overwhelmingly retweeting, and they've been saying, bringing in a couple of the other scholars who wrote in that journal. So this, it's not something that is out there and is, out disconnected from the population. And just in closing, and I know I just have a very little bit of time, but I just wanted to say how this project started. So, and I wrote a little bit about it. I said, in 2010, I had the great privilege of working with women in rural Kenya as I conducted an ethnographic research project unrelated to this paper. The knowledge sharing process was a catalyst for this essay. The sophisticated ways of knowing and understanding the world, their rights, and the challenges experienced greatly shaped my understanding of feminist work. These conversations are so important in disrupting the staggering impacts of global patriarchy. The constant interruption of conversations and interviews by text messages and phone calls spurred my thinking, and I began to conceptualize the mobile phone outside the economic realm, but not connected to the economic realm, and going beyond the illustrations of the dialectic relationship between structure and agency, and towards the circulation of reimagined epistemologies that speak to the realities of the lives of these women, and not only revealing the continued and lasting effects of encounters with empire, but also unveiling the multiplicity of effects and resistance to patriarchy, specifically in the context of this multivocal